The city of Los Angeles shimmered that night like a jewel under pressure. Beneath the warm California sky, a sea of flashbulbs bathed the entrance of the historic El Capitan Theater in electric light. Reporters buzzed, publicists whispered into earpieces, and starlets adjusted their gowns in glossy car doors. But amid all the usual Hollywood pageantry was an undercurrent of something else, something no one could name yet, but everyone would remember. It was the night Julia Garner's film premiere for Weapons was not only hijacked, but violently disrupted in a way no publicist could spin and no fan could forget. On the surface, everything was unfolding like a dream. Julia Garner, fresh from her Emmy-winning performances and now fronting one of the most anticipated psychological thrillers of the year, had arrived precisely on time. Her dress, a custom piece straight from Milan, shimmered like shattered glass. She radiated both vulnerability and power. The exact paradox that had made her Hollywood's new darling. She smiled, waved, and posed with the kind of gracious restraint that only comes after years of watching others do it wrong. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Inside, the film's producers celebrated. Press interviews were going smoothly. Even notoriously hard-to-please critics murmured about a possible Oscar nod. This was supposed to be the coronation of Julia Garner as a leading lady beyond prestige television. She had earned every inch of that red carpet with roles that left audiences shaken, not stirred. But red carpets are fragile things. They conceal more than they reveal. Unbeknownst to many, a ripple was moving through the perimeter. Security earpieces crackled. A name that wasn't on the list, a name that should have sent alarms blaring, was whispered between staffers, followed by a question that would haunt the night. Is she really here? She, Meghan Markle. She didn't arrive with a studio rep. She didn't announce herself through the proper PR channels. And she most certainly hadn't been invited. She appeared like a storm, unannounced, uninvited, and unwilling to be ignored. Dressed in black, as if mourning or reclaiming something lost, Meghan didn't stroll onto the carpet. She descended, calm, calculated, with a carefully poised expression that sat somewhere between regal indifference and restrained entitlement. Some recognized her instantly, and the first few gasps rippled through the crowd, not of awe, but of disbelief. What was she doing here? This wasn't a royal gala. It wasn't a charitable foundation or a glossy cover shoot. This was Julia Garner's moment, decades in the making, and Meghan Markle had just walked straight into it like it belonged to her. And that's when it happened. A shift, almost imperceptible, like glass cracking under pressure. Julia, midway through an interview with Entertainment Weekly, caught sight of Meghan approaching. Her expression didn't change at first. Professionals know how to hold a smile, even while their hearts are racing. But her eyes hardened, and her body stiffened. There was no mistaking it. She saw her, and the mood fractured instantly. It was in that moment, silent and brief, that the trajectory of the evening changed forever. Those around Julia later described it as a visceral transformation, not rage, not fear, but fury born of betrayal and disbelief. Because Julia knew what this was. This wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an intrusion, a calculated move meant to redirect the spotlight. And then came the clash. Security hesitated. Publicists panicked. Paparazzi surged, sensing blood in the water. And standing between the woman of the hour and the woman who refused to step aside was a metaphorical battleground of ambition, resentment, and years of unspoken rivalry in a town where everyone pretends to be friends until a spotlight is in play. But what makes this story more than just tabloid fodder is not the spectacle itself, but the unraveling beneath it. Because beneath Julia's visibly enraged confrontation, beneath Meghan's unnerving composure, was something more dangerous, a collision of two very different types of power. One forged by craft, sweat, and patience. The other powered by spectacle, monarchy, and media manipulation. Why did Meghan Markle crash this premiere? Was it really about publicity, or was it something more personal? And why did Julia Garner, a woman known for her poise, lose her composure so publicly, so explosively, in front of cameras? What was said between them in those few heated moments that led to Meghan being physically escorted out by security? What were the consequences afterward, within Hollywood's tight-lipped circles and beyond? This video will uncover it all, from the events leading up to that fateful night to the whispered rumors inside industry parties, and the invisible rules that govern fame and entitlement in Hollywood. We're going to explore what really happened. You'll hear from insiders, observers, and media analysts. We'll examine the emotional toll, the career implications, and the social media fallout that turned one woman's greatest professional triumph into a scene of public confrontation. You'll hear the backstage gossip, the secret texts, the deleted tweets, and the desperate attempts by both sides to control the narrative after the cameras stopped rolling. Because this wasn't just about two women on a red carpet. This was about what happens when boundaries are crossed, when reputations are threatened, and when Hollywood's unsaid rules are broken in front of the entire world. And most importantly, you'll discover the truth that no one else is talking about. Why Meghan Markle chose this premiere, this night, and this actress. But before we get there, let's rewind. Let's go back, not just to the day of the premiere, but to the simmering tension that had been building long before the velvet ropes were laid out. Tension between two women who had never publicly clashed, but whose silent rivalry had taken root in Hollywood's subconscious. One was the new darling of the screen, the other, a duchess without a kingdom, grasping for relevance in a town that is notoriously unforgiving. This is not a story of two celebrities. It's a story of legacy, ego, ambition, and the very thin line between assertion and sabotage. And it all begins with the woman who never should have been there. Los Angeles is no stranger to drama. It breathes it, sells it, and feeds it to the world like oxygen through a screen. But on the night of the Weapons premiere, even the most seasoned Hollywood veterans were unprepared for what would unfold. It was meant to be a celebration, one of those carefully orchestrated red carpet events where nothing is left to chance. Every camera angle pre-planned, every guest vetted, every security detail drilled with precision. And at the center of it all stood Julia Garner, a woman whose entire career had led to this exact moment. She had earned it. Years of brutal auditions, sleepless nights, minor roles, and thankless parts had brought her to the precipice of something bigger than acclaim. Julia wasn't just starring in Weapons. She had become its soul. A psychological thriller that pushed boundaries, asked hard questions, and featured a performance so layered it was already generating Oscar chatter. That night was supposed to be a culmination of effort, dedication, and transformation. And for the first hour, it was exactly that. The crowd was vibrant. Industry elites mingled with rising talent. Reporters lined up for interviews, and fans stood on barricades hoping for a glimpse of their favorite star. The usual chatter buzzed through the venue: box office predictions, rumors about future projects, snippets from early screenings. It was the kind of electricity only Hollywood could produce, a surreal mix of high art and glossy spectacle. Inside the theater, seats were filling. The air carried the warm smell of fresh popcorn and designer perfume. Julia, having made her first red carpet rounds, was glowing. Her face bore that rare mix of relief and excitement, the kind only an actor truly committed to her craft could wear when stepping into the spotlight not as someone else, but as herself. Her parents were there. So was her longtime acting coach. Even her rarely seen brother had flown in from New York for the occasion. No one, not even the most cynical observer, could have predicted that within the hour, this carefully balanced symphony of celebration would descend into chaos. It began subtly. A murmur moved through the press line. It wasn't loud or sudden, just a small, curious shift, like someone coughing during a piano solo. Cameras turned, not in mass, but in hesitant flickers. Photographers started whispering to each other. Then one voice said it a little too loud, a little too certain. "Is that Meghan Markle?" And just like that, the entire atmosphere changed. It was as if the entire red carpet had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. Heads swiveled. Earpieces crackled. Someone from security began pacing toward the entrance, their eyes narrowing as they scanned the unexpected arrival. Because there she was, Meghan Markle, former working royal, now self-proclaimed producer and podcast host, walking into a space that was never designed for her. She didn't have an invite. She didn't have a film credit. She wasn't even rumored to be making an appearance. Yet there she was, walking confidently in a black tailored blazer, heels that clicked like gunshots against the pavement, and a small, calculated smile playing on her lips. Not the warm, humble grin of someone attending a friend's success, but the tight, polished expression of a woman very aware she had just hijacked a narrative. For a few seconds, no one moved. Some fans gasped. Others assumed this had to be part of the show, a surprise appearance perhaps, maybe even a cameo in the film no one knew about. But the PR handlers knew better. And so did Julia. She saw her. Julia was mid-sentence in an interview with Variety when Meghan walked past the cameras just behind her. The interviewer faltered. The cameraman paused, instinctively pulling focus. Julia's publicist, standing just off frame, took a step forward and whispered something urgent to the nearby event manager. But Julia didn't need to be told. Her eyes had already locked onto the woman, now absorbing every flash of light the cameras had left. That first moment of recognition, sharp and instantaneous, set the tone for everything that followed. Meghan didn't acknowledge Julia. She didn't make eye contact, didn't offer a nod or a smile. Instead, she turned toward the crowd, waving softly, as if she belonged there, as if her presence was not only welcome, but expected. It was an act of performance in itself, a scene within the scene. The media, sensing a scandal in the making, shifted gears. Cameras turned, microphones extended, photographers recalibrated. And in that instant, Julia's night began to unravel. But what few knew in that chaotic moment was how deeply personal this felt for Julia. To the public, Julia Garner and Meghan Markle were two successful women operating in different spheres. One hailed from gritty prestige television and challenging indie films, the other from cable drama and the global spotlight of royal life. But within Hollywood, where networks overlap and relationships cross boundaries unseen by the audience, tensions simmer quietly. Julia had heard the rumors. Meghan had taken meetings with her agency. Whispers had floated around about Meghan eyeing roles in dramatic limited series, roles Julia had been in talks for. There was talk that Meghan had even referenced Julia's career as a template in certain circles. To Julia, this wasn't just an uninvited guest. This was a professional intruder. And that's what makes the events of that night so volatile. As Meghan moved deeper into the crowd, cameras now fully trailing her every step, Julia's team attempted to intercept. A handler approached Meghan and discreetly informed her she wasn't on the list. Meghan, calm and composed, reportedly responded with a single line, "I don't need a list." That line alone, quiet, almost whispered, triggered a storm behind the scenes. Security was summoned. Studio heads whispered urgently. Julia's publicist pulled her aside, offering options. Leave, make a statement, ignore it. Julia chose neither. Instead, she walked straight toward Meghan. The crowd parted, the noise dulled, and the cameras rolled. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not tonight. But this was no longer a premiere. It had become a showdown. And for those lucky, or perhaps unlucky, enough to witness it firsthand, what followed was one of the most unforgettable moments in modern Hollywood history. A confrontation so raw, so public, so emotionally charged, that even seasoned journalists were stunned into silence. This was no act, and the night was far from over. The air on Hollywood Boulevard that night was already heavy with perfume, anticipation, and the controlled chaos of a red carpet premiere. The lights were blinding, the fans loud, and the paparazzi worked like clockwork. Everything had been timed to precision. Who would arrive when, which outlet would get the first interview, and where the stars would stop to pose. No one had accounted for an uninvited former duchess stepping out of a sleek black vehicle and walking straight toward the chaos with unbothered grace. The vehicle itself was unmarked, no studio logos, no staff assisting her out. It was the kind of entrance someone makes when they want to appear spontaneous, but only after careful planning. When Meghan Markle emerged, it wasn't with hesitance or confusion. It was with confidence. The kind of confidence that suggested not only had she made this decision fully aware of the repercussions, but that she had also rehearsed it. Draped in a sharp, well-tailored black blazer with wide shoulder cuts that drew attention, Meghan looked every inch the calculated disruptor. Not overdressed, not underdressed, just enough to attract curiosity, just enough to appear like she might belong. And in Hollywood, sometimes that illusion is enough to get you past the door. But not this time. The moment her foot touched the red carpet, a ripple of tension moved through the gathered press. Unlike the usual roars of delight that accompany unexpected celebrity appearances, this one brought confusion. Reporters glanced at their event sheets. Her name wasn't listed. Photographers blinked at one another. Social media influencers began whispering. Security teams were on their radios before Meghan had taken her third step. She hadn't RSVP'd. No mention of her had been made by the studio. Not a single media outlet had been briefed to expect her. That was the first red flag. The second came in the form of her behavior. Meghan didn't veer off toward the press area. She didn't attempt to mingle with producers, actors, or executives. She didn't even feign humility. Instead, she posed, once, quickly, for the cameras, and began walking directly into the heart of the event, past the velvet ropes and behind the primary press zone, as though it were hers to conquer. It was in that moment, confident, calculated, cold, that Meghan's intentions became clear to those watching closely. This wasn't a simple mistake. This wasn't a confused guest who'd misread an invitation. This was someone crashing an event with purpose. The invasion wasn't in the physical act of walking in. It was in the assumption of belonging. That brazen entitlement, that belief that she could walk into the very spotlight someone else had earned and commanded, was what lit the fuse. The publicists were the first to react. Julia Garner's team exchanged frantic glances. Some tried to shield their client from seeing what was happening, but it was already too late. Julia had spotted her. She stood frozen for a moment, her face unreadable. Then, slowly, her features shifted from composed to tense. There was a silence around her now, like the stillness before thunder. Meghan's presence disrupted everything. Behind the scenes, assistants scrambled to confirm whether her name had somehow been missed. One checked the guest list again. Another called the event planner. No one had her name. She wasn't on the studio's distribution list. Not for guests, not for PR outreach, not even as a media attendee. Yet here she was, calmly inserting herself into an evening that had absolutely nothing to do with her. Why? That question lingered over the event like smog. Why here? Why now? Was this a PR maneuver? A power move? A cry for attention? Theories flew in every direction. Some suggested she was there to scout future roles. Others believed it was a last-ditch attempt to remain relevant in a Hollywood cycle that had grown bored of the royal defector narrative. A few even whispered she was there to provoke, to draw Julia Garner out into a confrontation for the cameras. And if that last theory seemed far-fetched at first, it wouldn't for long. Because Meghan wasn't trying to blend in. She was playing a role. It became increasingly apparent that her presence wasn't accidental. She seemed to know where to stand for the best camera angles. She paused exactly where the lighting was most flattering. She turned slightly when someone shouted her name, just enough for a picture-perfect side profile. She behaved not like a guest, but like a star whose stage had been unjustly taken from her. That's what made it so uncomfortable. For many in attendance, there was a dawning realization that they were watching an entirely different performance unfold. Not the premiere of weapons, but a live, unscripted display of ego versus earned success. The reactions were mixed, but polarized. Some guests ignored her entirely, their gaze firmly fixed ahead, as if her presence were a phantom best left unacknowledged. Others watched with a kind of horrified fascination. It was like witnessing a train derail in slow motion, no one quite sure whether to intervene or let it crash. Inside the theater, word began to spread. Meghan Markle was at the entrance. Meghan Markle was on the carpet. Meghan Markle had walked past security. Some attendees pulled out their phones. Others texted friends. But no one, and this was key, approached her to greet her or usher her in. There was no welcoming committee. No friendly faces. She was a ghost in a room full of breathing people. And yet she stayed. For nearly 15 minutes, Meghan hovered just off-center of the press line, standing like she belonged. She didn't retreat. She didn't ask for assistance. She simply existed in the space, aware that all eyes were watching, waiting, and wondering what would happen next. And then, slowly, the whispers turned to murmurs, and the murmurs to conversation. People weren't just confused anymore. They were offended. Not because Meghan had shown up, but because of what her presence implied. That the hard work of others could be interrupted without consequence. That fame, however acquired, could override protocol, etiquette, and the simplest form of respect. Julia Garner had been nothing if not respectful throughout her rise. She hadn't clawed her way through scandal. She hadn't leveraged drama or family chaos to gain attention. Her career had been built on performance, on dedication, on the kind of quiet work that doesn't trend but leaves a lasting impact. And now, in one moment, all of that was being overshadowed. That was the true invasion. Meghan didn't break into a locked building. She didn't climb over a fence. What she did was worse. She inserted herself into someone else's success story without permission, without acknowledgement, without grace. And as the cameras continued flashing and Julia Garner slowly began walking toward her, the atmosphere shifted from shock to impending confrontation. The premiere of Weapons was about to take a turn no one could have scripted. Before we can truly understand the weight of what happened on that night, we have to understand what Julia Garner was fighting for, what she had built, what she had overcome. Because this wasn't just any premiere. This wasn't a stop along the way. For Julia, this was a summit, and summits are hard-earned. Julia Garner didn't enter Hollywood on a wave of privilege or pre-built fame. She didn't come from a royal lineage, nor did she marry into one. She came from the bottom. Born in the Bronx, raised by a painter mother and a language-teaching father, Julia's path into the entertainment world was defined by grit, not glamour. Shy and soft-spoken as a child, she took up acting as a way to confront her social anxiety, an irony that isn't lost on those who've seen her command a screen like a seasoned general. Her first forays into film were not the glitzy blockbusters most young actresses dream of. They were indie films, raw, painful, unflinching. She wasn't afraid to be awkward, to be ugly, to be uncomfortable on screen. That was the difference. While others posed, she transformed. She didn't ask the audience to love her. She asked them to see her. And they did. Critics began to take note with performances in movies like Martha Marcy, May Marlene, and Electric Children. But it wasn't until her haunting portrayal of Ruth Langmore in Ozark that Julia Garner exploded into the cultural mainstream. Her portrayal of Ruth, a girl both hardened by poverty and softened by unexpected loyalties, was nothing short of transformative. She brought a fury to the role that felt lived in. Her southern drawl became iconic. Her eyes, always shifting between rage and vulnerability, hypnotized viewers. It was a performance that didn't just win her awards, it won her respect. And respect is the currency that lasts longer than fame. By the time Weapons came into her orbit, Julia Garner had already proven herself capable of leading. But this film was different. This wasn't her playing support to bigger stars. This was her name at the top of the billing. The entire marketing campaign centered on her face, her performance, her power. She had carried the film from the first casting meeting to the final cut. Weapons was a dark, character-driven psychological thriller about trauma, justice, and internal reckoning. And Julia didn't just act, she immersed. She spent months researching trauma psychology, working with therapists to understand grief responses, and rehearsing scenes of emotional breakdown that left her physically drained. The role demanded everything, and she gave everything. So when the premiere arrived, it wasn't just another job. It was a moment of validation, an industry acknowledgement that she had arrived, that the girl who once trembled before auditions had become a woman who could carry a studio release on her shoulders. And the industry noticed. Directors were already circling. Studios were quietly building slates around her availability. Julia had reached a place that few actresses ever do, a place where talent and timing intersect to create something undeniable. She was at the center of her own narrative, finally. That's what made the intrusion so offensive. When Meghan Markle arrived, uninvited and unannounced, she didn't just disrupt a red carpet. She disrupted a moment that had been 15 years in the making. She stepped into a spotlight that had been painstakingly earned by someone else, and acted as if she had every right to be there. And perhaps to Meghan, she did. After all, Meghan Markle had once been an actress herself. Before the royal titles, before the scandals, before the exile from Buckingham Palace, she was Rachel Zane on Suits. She knew the industry. She knew the red carpets. And she had grown accustomed to cameras turning when she walked in. But that was a lifetime ago. And more importantly, Meghan's recent ventures into the entertainment world had been fraught with setbacks. A canceled Spotify deal. A Netflix project quietly shelved. Public interviews that backfired. Podcasts that fizzled. She was no longer a fresh-faced actress hungry for her big break. She was a woman trying to hold on to relevance in an industry that moves on quickly. Hollywood remembers loyalty, but it also has a short memory for those who step away without leaving something meaningful behind. And Meghan had stepped away, only to return years later, demanding the same reverence as before. It didn't sit well with people who had clawed their way up in her absence. So when she arrived at the weapons premiere, it wasn't just her presence that rankled, it was the implication behind it. That she could insert herself into someone else's story and claim a piece of it without asking. Julia had been patient her whole career. She had endured the patronizing meetings, the rejections, the low-paying indies, the roles that asked her to cry on cue and disappear afterward. And now, when it was finally her night, someone who hadn't been invited was trying to take a slice of it. But Julia wasn't going to let that happen. Not this time. Not here. This wasn't a petty rivalry. This wasn't jealousy. It was a defense of dignity, of boundaries, of the quiet assertion that no, not everyone gets to skip the line. And so, as Julia walked toward Meghan, flanked by stunned assistants and buzzing press, it wasn't the move of a jealous celebrity. It was the move of a woman reclaiming the moment she had fought for. A moment she wasn't going to let anyone take. No matter who they thought they were. It happened in a heartbeat, but everyone there swore the air changed when their eyes met. Julia Garner had just finished posing for a final round of photos near the sponsor backdrop, the noise of flashing bulbs and shouted questions still echoing in her ears. She was adjusting her gown subtly at the waist, preparing for the slow walk toward the theater entrance when a shift in body language from the people around her drew her attention. Not words, just a silence, a subtle tightening in the space, as though gravity itself had changed course. Julia turned her head and saw Meghan. She didn't need anyone to explain. The context was immediate. The chill wasn't from the night air. It was the shock wave of recognition laced with disbelief. There she was, Meghan Markle, standing casually in a space she was never meant to occupy, wearing a carefully controlled smile, flanked by no handlers, no press badges, no studio credentials, just presence. Pure and deliberate. And for one brutal, electric second, their eyes locked. Julia didn't look away. Neither did Meghan. And in that moment, the energy between them, two women from opposite ends of the fame spectrum, collided with full force. There was no greeting, no nod, no acknowledgement wrapped in courtesy. The message was mutual and loud, even in silence. You shouldn't be here. The onlookers caught it. The photographers snapped photos, unsure whether what they were witnessing would explode or evaporate. One entertainment blogger who stood near the velvet rope line would later describe it like this. It was like watching a glass of red wine tip over in slow motion. You knew it was going to ruin the white tablecloth, but you couldn't look away. Because while the cameras couldn't hear the words, they captured everything else. Julia's shoulders stiffened, not dramatically, not performatively, but in a way that only those who knew her would recognize as an internal temperature shift. Her jaw tightened, not enough to seem combative, but just enough to signify restraint. She didn't move forward right away. She took a measured breath and simply held Meghan's gaze. Meghan, for her part, didn't blink. She offered a small smile, tight-lipped, ambiguous. Not the warm greeting of a familiar colleague, nor the passive civility one might offer a stranger. It was something else. Something that looked, from certain angles, dangerously close to smug. That's when Julia stepped forward. It wasn't an aggressive walk. There was no dramatic flourish, no heel-clicking storm. But it had intention. Each step carried weight, purpose. By the time she reached the edge of the press boundary where Meghan stood, the chatter had died down. Cameras didn't flash as much now. Even the seasoned reporters paused, sensing this was no ordinary celebrity interaction. It felt like a scene from a film. Two protagonists locked in an unspoken standoff, the dialogue etched across their faces instead of spoken aloud. Witnesses later swore Julia muttered something, but it was too low for anyone to catch on record. One bystander thought she heard the words, "What are you doing?" Another insisted she said, "This is not your event." Neither version was confirmed. What was certain was Meghan's response, or lack thereof. She tilted her head slightly. That same composed, unmoved posture. She didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't explain. She simply held her ground. And in that quiet, simmering moment, something inside Julia snapped. Not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that only someone whose night had been slowly chipped away would understand. Because this wasn't about ego. It was about boundary violation. Julia wasn't demanding reverence. She wasn't trying to dominate the night. She had done the work, put in the years, played the long game. All she wanted was a moment that was hers. Just this one. And Meghan had taken it, brazenly, unapologetically. In a different world, maybe this encounter would have passed without confrontation. Maybe if Julia hadn't been carrying the weight of expectation, or if Meghan had simply acknowledged her presence with respect. But that world didn't exist that night. What existed was a charged atmosphere filled with broken protocol and ignored etiquette. Julia leaned in closer. Not enough to invade space, but enough to make it known she was drawing a line. That moment, the lean in, the barely audible exchange, the tightening of expression, was captured by at least 6 cameras, all of which would flood social media within minutes. Some interpreted Julia's expression as outrage. Others called it disappointment. But anyone who truly understood what it's like to earn something, only to see it eclipsed by someone who had no business being there, recognized it for what it was, heartbreak laced with fury. And Meghan? She didn't retreat. She stayed in place like someone who knew she had already shifted the balance of the room, like someone who believed that simply being seen was enough. She didn't engage further. She didn't explain. She let Julia absorb the reality and walked past her with deliberate ease. That walk, those few, measured steps away from Julia, were perhaps the final act of defiance. She hadn't won anything, but she had made herself unforgettable in the worst way. Security approached seconds later. Whispers turned into action. The head of the studio's event team moved in, whispering into Meghan's ear. The conversation was brief. Her smile didn't fade. She nodded. Calmly. She turned and began walking toward the exit. Not rushed, not escorted yet, but aware that the unspoken decision had been made. Meghan Markle would not be staying, but the damage had already been done. Julia returned to her press duties, but something had changed. Her expression, though professional, carried the weight of confrontation. She tried to reclaim the night, continued her interviews, posed for photos, but even the sharpest observer could see it. Something had been taken from her. And in the days that followed, those few seconds of eye contact would become the subject of endless debate. Was it calculated on Meghan's part? Was Julia's reaction justified? Could something else have been said or done to avoid the spectacle? But none of those questions would erase the reality of what happened in that charged instant. 2 women. 1 spotlight. 1 space that wasn't big enough for both. What happened on the red carpet was as much a breakdown of protocol as it was a symbolic collision of clout and control. In Hollywood, nothing about a major premiere is accidental. Not the color of the carpet, not the seat placements, not even the temperature of the champagne served to VIP guests. Every detail is curated with obsessive precision, particularly for events tied to a studio's most prized films. And for Julia Garner's Weapons premiere, that level of control was taken seriously. Every guest was on a vetted list. Security clearances were double-checked. Studio liaisons and publicists were assigned zones. And yet, somehow, Meghan Markle, uninvited, unregistered, and without escort, slipped past all of it. The question that gripped everyone afterward wasn't why she showed up, but how. Theories swirled like wildfire in the hours following her abrupt exit. Was she smuggled in by a contact within the event team? Did she forge her credentials? Had someone been bribed? Or was the mere weight of her name enough to override the standard security filters? Let's start at the beginning. According to multiple staffers who worked the venue that night, entry protocols were airtight. Checkpoints were manned by both studio security and contracted personnel from a private firm hired specifically for high-profile red carpet events. Each person entering through the press corridor had to present a QR-coded digital credential. Every guest on the VIP list was pre-registered, with their IDs matched against their digital badge. The system was supposed to be foolproof. And yet, somewhere between the curb and the camera line, Meghan Markle bypassed it. Some claim she arrived through a side entrance, one typically used by delivery crews or internal staff. An anonymous security team member told an online entertainment outlet that a black SUV pulled up to the side of the building just as a group of production assistants were unloading last-minute supplies. The vehicle reportedly idled for just under 2 minutes before a lone passenger emerged. Meghan, carrying nothing, speaking to no one, and walking directly toward the carpet. She didn't flash a badge. She didn't stop to check in. She simply moved. And no one stopped her. That's the kind of access usually reserved for studio executives, major celebrities with clear ties to the film, or invited royalty, not a former duchess with no role in the project. Which begs the obvious question, did someone inside help her? There's reason to believe so. Sources close to the event's planning team later confirmed that Meghan's name had come up during early invitation discussions. Not because she was a serious contender for a guest spot, but because there was already concern she might try to attend. Apparently, there had been unofficial noise from a third-party PR firm loosely associated with Meghan's brand, suggesting she was interested in supporting the premiere and loved Julia's recent work. But no follow-up ever materialized. No formal request was submitted. No seats were allocated for her. The studio made the decision to leave her off the list entirely. According to one insider, it was a clear no. Julia's team wanted to keep the night about the work, not distractions. So how did she get in? The most likely explanation points to a lapse at the side entrance. An unguarded access point. A split-second opportunity. And someone, either through miscommunication, fear of confrontation, or simple awe, allowed her to pass. There's also the question of optics. Meghan Markle is no ordinary guest. Her presence carries the kind of cultural baggage that causes even seasoned professionals to second-guess protocol. Stopping her at the door could easily spiral into a PR disaster if mishandled. It's not hard to imagine a young staffer, perhaps unsure of the rules or intimidated by the possibility of offending someone with global name recognition, deciding to look the other way. One witness, a photographer near the press entrance, claimed he saw a brief standoff near the rope line between Meghan and an assistant producer from the event staff. According to him, the producer tried to explain that Meghan was not on the list and needed to check in. Meghan allegedly replied, "I won't be long. I'm just here to support Julia." And before the staffer could protest further, she stepped onto the carpet, absorbed instantly by the press swarm. If that quote is accurate, it speaks volumes. Not only was she aware of her uninvited status, but she also leaned on familiarity, on the implication of a connection to Julia, to justify her presence. That line, "just here to support Julia," was enough to create confusion, enough to cause hesitation, enough to break the chain of command in a place where hesitating is all it takes for chaos to seep in. The next 30 minutes were a scramble behind the scenes. Event coordinators frantically messaged one another. The studio's head of publicity was reportedly apoplectic, according to a senior insider, demanding to know how someone without clearance had made it past 2 checkpoints and into the core of a live-streamed media event. There were efforts to intercept her discreetly, to move her to a neutral zone, to prevent a confrontation. But the damage was already done. By the time Julia Garner locked eyes with Meghan, cameras were already recording. Dozens of cell phones were aimed in their direction. The press pool had split in half, some still following Julia, others pivoting to capture Meghan's movements. The center of gravity had shifted. Security finally approached Meghan after Julia had confronted her and walked away. The conversation was quick, quiet, and visibly composed. Meghan, ever aware of the optics, nodded gently and complied without a scene. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She turned and walked away, flanked by 2 members of the studio's event team and a single security guard. Her departure was calm, controlled, but cold, and perhaps that's what made it more disturbing. There was no embarrassment, no confusion, just a woman who had entered a space she wasn't invited to, stood in the middle of it, absorbed the attention, and left, only after the moment had been made. The security breach prompted an immediate internal review. Emails were sent out within hours. The head of the venue's security was temporarily suspended pending investigation. By the following day, industry blogs were flooded with speculation. Twitter feeds overflowed with clips of Meghan's arrival, photos of Julia's reaction, and furious debates over who was in the wrong. But inside the studio, there was no debate. Julia Garner had been ambushed on the most important night of her career, and someone had let it happen. Whether through negligence or manipulation, the invisible lines that separate preparation from chaos had been crossed. And the person standing at the center of that breach walked in wearing a smile, left without apology, and forced an entire industry to ask itself what happens when fame becomes a weapon, not earned, but wielded. Inside the makeshift media lounge set up just beyond the red carpet, Julia Garner's publicist sat hunched over her phone, lips tight, brow furrowed, and eyes darting between group messages that were starting to ring like fire alarms. What was supposed to be a seamless night was unraveling in real time, and the very people whose job it was to control the narrative were now finding themselves completely outpaced by a story spiraling far beyond their grasp. The moment Meghan Markle appeared on the carpet, a chain reaction ignited inside the PR war room. Dozens of professionals, studio executives, network handlers, event planners, and celebrity reps were thrust into a silent frenzy. They didn't scream. They didn't argue. They did what professionals do when things fall apart. They moved fast, whispered loudly, and typed even faster. Publicists are the architects of order in a town built on spectacle. They know how to plan for wardrobe malfunctions, surprise arrivals, technical errors, even an actor stumbling through interviews. But what they can't plan for is someone with global notoriety crashing an event without clearance, then becoming the main headline within 15 minutes. Julia's team was the first to respond. Her lead publicist, seasoned from a decade in the industry, had seen her fair share of PR emergencies, on-set injuries, online controversies, awkward interviews. But this was something new. This wasn't just a red carpet distraction. It was a hostile takeover of an entire brand launch. She quickly called the studio's senior PR officer and delivered the news flatly. "She's here. On the carpet." And Julia just saw her. There was a pause on the other end. Then a clipped response. "Handle it." But what does handle it mean when the person you're trying to remove is Meghan Markle? She was too famous to be dismissed without consequence, too unpredictable to be ignored, and too practiced to show her hand. That made the situation fragile. One wrong move, one aggressive ejection, one security guard's misstep, one leaked video of an ugly confrontation, and the story would no longer be about Julia's movie. It would be about Meghan being mistreated. Or worse, victimized. So the publicists played defense. The first goal was containment. Julia's team moved to reposition her. Keep her front and center. Guide her back toward the main press outlets. Smile. Answer questions. Appear unbothered. One assistant discreetly handed Julia a note with updates. Meghan was still present. Security was being dispatched. "Stay calm. Let us do our job." Julia nodded, eyes flaring only briefly. She resumed her interview with the Hollywood Reporter, never letting the camera see the full weight of what she was processing. But her team was scrambling. The second priority was media redirection. A studio PR agent pulled aside the lead coordinator from Entertainment Tonight and whispered a request. Focus questions on the filmmaking process. Avoid anything political and do not, under any circumstances, mention Meghan Markle. Other publicists repeated the message up and down the press line. The code phrase being passed around was "no crossover," shorthand for steering coverage back to the actual film. Meanwhile, Meghan's sudden presence triggered a burst of inbound requests from press outlets eager to capitalize on the moment. Journalists began texting their contacts. "Can we ask about Meghan? Do we have quotes on the confrontation? Was she supposed to be here?" The answer to all of it, from the publicists, was a hard and immediate no. Every second spent reacting to Meghan's entrance was a second taken away from Julia's premiere. That was the real damage. Not the headlines, not the confrontation, but the sheer distraction. The night was slipping through their fingers, and the person doing it wasn't even a part of the movie. Backstage, inside the green room, Julia's manager pulled her aside. He was calm, but his eyes betrayed urgency. He handed her a bottled water and asked if she wanted to address it, publicly or privately. Julia shook her head. "Not now," she said. The message was clear: let it die in silence. But the silence outside was cracking. Meghan had not been removed yet. She hovered near the edge of the press area, posing for a few seconds, then adjusting her blazer with calculated grace. She wasn't talking to reporters. She wasn't giving sound bites. But she was there, and that alone was enough to shift every lens in her direction. The studio's crisis team huddled just beyond the red carpet. 5 people, one mission: extract her without creating a scandal. One member suggested approaching her with a private escort to the VIP lounge. Get her off the carpet, calm her down, explain the situation gently. Another argued that doing so would validate her presence. "She's not a guest," he said. She should not be offered anything. A third voice chimed in with the most cynical but perhaps most accurate take. She doesn't want to stay. She wants to be seen. And therein lay the dilemma. If Meghan was simply crashing for attention, then any move to stop her would play into her hands. A dramatic removal would guarantee viral footage. An argument with staff would make headlines. Even a forced interaction with Julia would spin into a false narrative of rivalry. The publicists needed a third option, one that would deflate the moment, not inflate it. So they resorted to what Hollywood does best. They created a distraction. Within minutes, an announcement rang through the venue that the cast of Weapons was moving inside for a group photo and pre-screening greeting. Julia was whisked into the lobby with the rest of the film's leads. Flashbulbs returned to her. Attention gradually redirected. For a brief second, it worked. And then someone on Twitter posted a photo. Meghan Markle standing alone, just off-center, expression serene, captioned, "When you weren't invited to the party, but you show up looking better than the guest of honor." It exploded. Thousands of retweets. Dozens of hot takes. Memes. Speculation. Rumors. Hashtags. The viral machine had started, and the publicists could do nothing to stop it. Meghan had walked onto a red carpet, uninvited, stood still for less than 10 minutes, and hijacked the conversation for the rest of the night. And the publicists? They were left chasing shadows. By the time Meghan agreed to leave, quietly, without resistance, the internet had already done the job for her. The headlines were writing themselves. The stories were being framed. And Julia's team knew what came next. Damage control. Over the following 24 hours, Julia's publicist would coordinate a round of tightly controlled interviews. They would emphasize her professionalism, her focus, her refusal to engage in unnecessary distractions. Carefully worded statements would be drafted, not to name Meghan, but to steer the narrative back to Weapons, back to the film, back to the work. Because that's what Julia wanted. Not revenge, not headlines, just the work. But the publicists knew the truth. The damage had already been done. It didn't happen in front of the cameras, not exactly. The explosion everyone had been bracing for. The moment when professionalism finally gave way to raw, unscripted fury, came not under the full glare of media lights, but in the margin just beyond them. Close enough to be heard by a few dozen onlookers, but far enough that no mic picked it up in full. Still, everyone who witnessed it knew. Julia Garner had had enough. Until that point, she had kept her composure with astonishing restraint. She smiled during interviews. She posed for every outlet. She answered the same repetitive questions about transforming into character and working with such a brilliant cast. Her voice remained even, her posture perfect, her face animated enough to look engaged. But just beneath the surface, something was boiling. She had spotted Meghan early on. She had witnessed the distraction take hold like a virus through the crowd. She had tried, desperately, to remain above it. But Meghan wasn't just in the building. She was in the spotlight. And that spotlight was supposed to belong to someone who'd earned it. For over an hour, Julia had watched her team scramble. She saw photographers start to angle away from her and toward Meghan. She noticed how her interviewers were distracted, glancing past her shoulder to see where the former Duchess had gone. And most tellingly, she saw the confusion in the eyes of fans, some of whom were now gathered by the barricades, phones out, chanting Meghan's name like she was the lead actress of the film. It was a moment that threatened to break her in two. She had kept it together as long as she could. But when Meghan casually positioned herself near the grand archway entrance to the theater, a deliberate visual spot that would be featured in almost every media outlet's photography reel, that's when something inside Julia snapped. She handed her champagne flute to an assistant, nodded once, and started walking, firmly, fast, and without breaking her gaze. People moved out of the way instinctively. They saw it on her face. This wasn't a photo op. This was personal. Meghan was mid-conversation with a social media influencer, apparently unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, of what was about to hit her. Her posture was relaxed. Her blazer jacket fell just so, styled as if she had walked out of a Vanity Fair spread. She wasn't laughing or joking, but her expression suggested calm satisfaction, like someone who had achieved what they came for. Julia didn't yell. She didn't scream. But her voice, sharp and unwavering, cut through the music and murmurs like a scalpel. "You need to leave," she said. Meghan blinked, clearly taken aback, though her face didn't betray much. Her smile faltered for the first time all evening. "This is not your event," Julia continued, stepping closer. "You weren't invited. You're not welcome here. You're not part of this. And you know that." Several witnesses described the exchange as low but intense. The kind of conversation that wasn't intended for the world to hear, but ended up reaching more ears than intended simply because of the shock it generated. One woman, a junior publicist standing just a few feet away, said she felt paralyzed by the weight of Julia's voice. "I've never seen her like that," she recalled later. "She wasn't angry in the way celebrities usually are. She was devastated, and that made it worse." Meghan held her position for a moment. Her expression didn't sour, but her eyes did narrow. She replied with something that no one captured in full, though a few nearby believed it was along the lines of, "I'm not here for you, Julia." And that was what broke everything. Julia's voice sharpened again, this time with more steel in it. "No, you're here for exactly that. To be seen. To hijack something that you had no hand in building. I worked for this. I bled for this role. And you, what did you do? Just show up and expect the room to turn to you? It's not your crown anymore. This is my night. So leave." Gasps fluttered through the air like a ripple on still water. Several phones went up, no doubt trying to capture what they could, but security personnel and assistants moved fast to shield the confrontation. A few seconds of brutal silence passed. Meghan didn't argue. She didn't fight, but the expression on her face changed entirely. The mask slipped, just slightly. She straightened her jacket and turned without a word, walking away from Julia and heading toward the corridor where event staff were already waiting to escort her out. The path was cleared for her exit. No cameras followed. No fans waved. In her wake, the noise slowly resumed. The band started up again. Conversations began humming. The media line reoriented itself. But in the pocket of air where that confrontation had just taken place, everything felt scorched. Julia remained standing for a few moments longer. Her chest rose and fell with deep, measured breaths. Her team began to move toward her, but she held up a hand. Not yet. She needed the moment. To feel it. To grieve it, perhaps. And then she composed herself. Back to center. Back to grace. When she returned to the red carpet line, a reporter tried to sneak in a question. Was that about Meghan? But was immediately cut off by a glare from Julia's PR rep. "No questions outside the film," the publicist barked. "Let's keep it professional." And Julia did. But the world had already seen her break. It wasn't a tabloid tantrum. It wasn't diva behavior. It was the kind of explosion that only happens when someone is pushed too far for too long. When everything you've worked for is threatened in the flash of a camera. When someone walks into your moment and demands a piece of it just because they believe they're entitled to it. Julia had drawn a line. And for the first time in recent memory, someone had stood up and said what many in Hollywood had been too afraid to voice. Fame alone is not a free pass. Not when it comes at someone else's expense. As Meghan walked away from the confrontation with Julia Garner, there was no trace of rush in her stride. Her posture was straight. Her hands remained calm at her sides. If anything, she carried herself like a woman escaping the scene of a battlefield in slow motion, not because she wasn't wounded, but because she refused to let anyone see it. But inside, according to a witness who later spoke to a Hollywood blogger off the record, Meghan's mood had shifted. The tight composure she wore like a designer jacket had frayed. Beneath the stillness, something bristled. Once off the carpet and past the velvet ropes, Meghan was led to a discreet area just adjacent to the theater's side entrance. 2 event security staff stood nearby, maintaining distance but watching her closely. A third person, reportedly from her own media team, or perhaps a friend, joined her with a phone in hand. What followed wasn't a dramatic outburst. There was no slamming of doors, no shouting. Instead, Meghan simply turned to the person beside her and said, with a measured voice, "I didn't do anything wrong." That phrase, repeated several times over the next few minutes, would define her stance for the rest of the evening. To those around her, she wasn't defensive, she was resolute. Unshaken, like someone who felt genuinely misunderstood and unjustly targeted. And in that moment, she may have believed it. To Meghan, her presence wasn't an act of trespass, but of visibility. She'd claimed to be there, supporting Julia. She hadn't barged onto stage. She hadn't grabbed a mic. She hadn't stopped interviews or disrupted the screening. All she had done, from her perspective, was walk in, smile for a few cameras, and stand for less than 20 minutes. Her logic, whether you believed it or not, was built on the idea that presence alone doesn't equal interference. But the problem was, this wasn't a normal event. This wasn't a charity fundraiser or a media panel. This was a premiere, a sacred night in the entertainment industry where everything hinges on centering the lead. Especially when that lead is not just an actor, but a rising star finally stepping into a leading role that took years to land. To the public, it may have looked like Meghan had been shooed away. But to Meghan, it felt like a public humiliation. The Duchess, used to people either admiring or fearing her influence, had been told, directly and in front of industry cameras, that she didn't belong. And not just by a staff member or anonymous security officer, by Julia Garner herself. For Meghan, that confrontation cut deeper than any tabloid article ever had. Later that evening, in the privacy of a hotel suite reportedly arranged as her base for post-event meetings, Meghan is said to have spoken at length to her close circle. One source familiar with the gathering recounted the mood as bruised, but not broken. Meghan's tone, according to this source, was more philosophical than angry. She asked questions aloud, the kind that carried more weight than mere curiosity. Why is everyone so threatened by me? Why am I always the villain in someone else's story? What would they say if I hadn't shown up? These weren't questions asked for sympathy. They were strategic, reflective of a woman trying to make sense of a system that had, once again, rejected her. Because in Meghan's mind, she didn't crash the premiere, she added to it. She saw herself as a figure of cultural relevance. A woman who had lived through one of the most brutal media storms of the 21st century and survived it. Her presence at an event, whether by invitation or not, was a story. And in the currency of media, stories hold power. But what she may not have realized, or didn't care to admit, was that not all power is welcomed. From Meghan's perspective, Julia's reaction was excessive, cold, even cruel. That's the version she reportedly shared in private. That Julia could have handled the situation with more grace, perhaps taken the high road, or simply ignored her. Meghan didn't deny they weren't friends. She admitted she didn't know Julia personally. But to her, that didn't justify the level of public rejection she received. There's a way to treat people, she allegedly said to one friend. And that wasn't it. But others saw the encounter differently. One PR strategist from a rival agency commented anonymously the following day, Meghan expected to walk into someone else's coronation and not be treated like an intruder. That's entitlement, not support. Her presence, whether maliciously intended or not, was interpreted as an overt power play. And Hollywood is allergic to uninvited power. Still, Meghan wasn't going to retreat without crafting her own version of the story. That's the game. You don't just control the event, you control the aftermath. Within hours of the confrontation, friendly online platforms began posting articles questioning the severity of Julia's reaction. Headlines began emerging. Did Julia overreact? Was Meghan just showing support? Why the Hollywood machine still fears Meghan Markle? The narrative was being seeded. Meghan didn't respond to the incident directly. She didn't need to. Not yet. But her allies were already speaking on her behalf. A former staffer, speaking to a digital magazine, said, Meghan is used to people turning her presence into a scandal. She knew what would happen the moment she stepped out of that SUV. But she didn't do it for headlines. She did it because she refuses to live small. It was a line designed to appeal to her base. Those who see her as a symbol of resilience, of bold womanhood, of unapologetic visibility. And for some, it worked. Online debate was split. Half the internet condemned the intrusion. The other half praised her bravery. But no one was neutral. And that, perhaps, was Meghan's real victory. Because even though she was escorted out, even though she was called out in front of peers, even though the night did not go in her favor, the spotlight followed her anyway. The conversation pivoted. Julia may have owned the stage, but Meghan owned the narrative, at least temporarily. But what was undeniable was this. Meghan had forced a reckoning. About boundaries. About entitlement. About what it means to be famous, and what it means to be relevant. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't thrown anything. She hadn't staged a dramatic scene. She had simply shown up. And in doing so, she exposed just how fragile fame can be, how easily it can be hijacked, even by presence alone.